Welcome to another session of the Southeast Asia program at Stanford University. My name is Don Emerson. I run the program, and today I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, University of Hong Kong Professor Enze Han. He has just begun his stay at Stanford as a Li Kong Chian Fellow on Contemporary Southeast Asia, an award that we make every year jointly with the National University of Singapore. To save time, and with an apology to Enze, I will greatly abbreviate his lengthy curriculum vitae. Suffice it to note that Professor Han's many publications include a recent book, Asymmetrical Neighbours, Borderland State Building between China and Southeast Asia. His scholarly affiliations prior to joining the University of Hong Kong have included the University of London, Princeton University, and the University for Advanced Study. The title of his talk is Rethinking China's Presence in Southeast Asia, Influences, Unintended Consequences, and Ripple Effects. He will speak for 30, 40, maybe max 45 minutes, followed by a little bit of interaction with me, followed by an opportunity to answer questions from our audience. And last but not least, let me say that on the 10th of May, we'll have another webinar on the subject of women and political power in Southeast Asia. We'll be posting that information probably within this week. Anyway, thank you for joining, and thank you to Enze for being willing to speak. The floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, Don. It's a pleasure today to talk about this ongoing project that I'm working on, Rethinking China's Presence in Southeast Asia, Influences, Unintended Consequences, and Ripple Effects. I will talk about 30 minutes in terms of this, some of the theoretical entry point that I'm going to make, and plus a couple of empirical cases that I'm working on, and afterwards I'll be engaging with a conversation with Professor Emerson in terms of today's conversation. Okay, so I guess there's tremendous interest in China's growing influence globally, right? And particularly in this country. And the US is very concerned about the rising China, and also the almost peer competitor and that China is becoming for the United States. And oftentimes people talk about China's growing influence. The region of Southeast Asia has often been considered as at the forefront of such competition, right? And partly because of history and geography, in a sense that this region is the doorstep of China, and it's also a region that historically US has tremendous amount of historical engagement and also security partnerships with, right? However, according to recent reports by CSIS, for example, many experts, for example, have come of the opinion that China is considered as holding slightly more political power, but also more economic power and influence in the region, right? And at the same time, the region views China as much more influential, for example, the United States in many aspects. So in this kind of conversation, when people talk about China's influence, one of the main questions that today I want to engage with is, what exactly is China's influence? How do we know it when we see it? The reason I ask this question is that empirically, particularly in media reportage about China and China's influence in other parts of the world and in Southeast Asia in particular, there's often, how should I say, a slippage in terms of what type of actors and what type of influence people are talking about. So I will use this example of one of those this is a list of, let's say, news headlines about a casino city was opening up. It's called Chugogo along sort of in Myanmar's current state along the Thai-Myanmar border. So you can see the list of headlines talked about, there's a China-backed new city project. But empirically, if you look into the details of it, this project was done by a company called Yatai Group. And then the head of that company was a fugitive Chinese businessman who are engaging with these illicit activities in Southeast Asia, right? But somehow the media continue to tie it together with that this casino new city project is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and in some way try to connect with the Chinese state, which the Chinese embassy, in fact deny there's any involvement of the Chinese state in such a casino project along the Thai-Burmese border. Right. So that exactly is the point that I'm making today, in a way that when we look at many of those kind of conversations that people talk about China's influence in Southeast Asia, we have to be careful in terms of what exactly we are engaging with. The reason is for two reasons. There's two reasons for that, and also my talk is going to be engaging these two aspects of a theoretical entry point. First is basically about variety of actors. Who do we mean by China, right? And the media and many scholars tend to lump together everything related with China as China, right? So that is one element I'm going to engage with. The other is basically a difference between intended versus unintended consequences when we talk about inference empirically. So first, about this variety of actors dimension. For example, in Qin Li's work, right, she talked about the specter of global China, China's presence in Africa. Then she mentions basically the global China that we are interested in takes myriad of forms, right? There is foreign investment, labor, institutions, infrastructure, civil society, media, joint ventures, higher education, and a variety of sectors. Many different individuals, companies are engaged with. So when we think about Southeast Asia, when we talk about China's presence in the region, we have to be careful in terms of what exactly are the actors we are referring to as China. So basically by this, I mean that we have to differentiate, for example, at least between state versus non-state actors, right? So what do I mean by state? And obviously there'll be state diplomatic missions in all the countries in the region. And then you have many, let's say, state-owned enterprises. They might be highly dependent on the state, but then often operate in quite autonomous ways because they have their own sort of the financial budgetary concerns to have, and also they even often they compete with each other in terms of opening up the international market for themselves. At the same time, there are also lots of NGOs or civil society organizations that are perhaps partly related with the Chinese state or not, right? So conventionally, there are lots of, let's say, Chinese voluntary associations, right? That historically tie the diaspora with China, right? So many times those kind of organizations, in terms of commerce, the Bureau of Commerce, in terms of like home association, etc. Right? I mean, they perhaps sometimes have some connection with the embassy, but not necessarily they're directly on the budget of the Chinese state. In addition, there are increasingly more private businesses going abroad to Southeast Asia. Companies opening branches and investing in Southeast Asian economies. So these days, for example, FDI from China, from private companies, enterprises from China, is at same level with the US FDI to Singapore, right? So in a way that Chinese FDI is almost as the equivalent of US FDI to Singapore. So we're talking about tremendous amount of private businesses that are going abroad to Southeast Asia. And finally, there are ordinary Chinese citizens who migrated in recent years to Southeast Asia. for work, for study, for retirement. And on top of many millions of tens of millions of tourists go to Southeast Asia on a daily basis. Now, I'm talking about pre-COVID, right? Basically, I think COVID has a fundamental change on that type of movement of people. So we can talk about the impact of COVID later on during the Q&A if you're interested in. But then at least before the COVID period, we are looking at tens of millions of people who are flying every day to Southeast Asia, right? So that is basically the type of variety of actors we are engaging with. So this is the first element when we want to talk about China, we have to be careful in terms of what exactly are actors we are referring to. Now, the second element I'm engaging with is this difference between power, influence, and also intention. So this is in international relations. Previously, scholars have differentiated these two concepts of power versus influence. So power is generally the overall capacity, right, in terms of how much military equipment you have or how big your economy is, etc. And then influence, according to Evelyn Goh, is more of the act to modify the other partner's preferences. So which means in this case, influence operation involve a very deliberate act to change the other party's behavior, right? So that means that there is a significant amount of intention on part of the influencer for what the influencee should behave, right? So this is very much a very narrow definition of influence. But now here is something I'm going to engage with is that sure, there are lots of events that happened as a result of deliberate rational behavior, and then the outcome is directly related with the intended purpose of the rational actor. But then again, in social reality, lots of things happen out of nowhere, right? There are many unanticipated consequences of purposive social action. For example, according to Robert Merton, in one of those classical sociology piece, right? So in a way that because of the complex interactions that constitute society, and actions ramifies, and the consequences often occur not necessarily restricted to specific areas in which they were initially intended. They often occur in random or interrelated, even random places, right? So for example, there are a few ways how those kind of unintended consequences can occur. The first one is that the actions can lead to a byproduct outcome. So for example, if you want to influence somebody, and then somehow another outcome occurred as a byproduct, which was not necessarily envisioned, right? There's nobody can know it all. You never know what your action will lead to, the reactions, in other parties. And then through the force of outside intervention, sometimes the achieved outcome is very different from what initially intended by this rational actor. And finally, there are many cases that the outcomes are actually achieved not by the intention or the action by the actor, rather through natural coincidence and by chance, right? By happenstance, for example, something just happened. So these are basically, when we look at empirically, what do we mean by influence, we have to be careful in terms of many times they might be just simply unintended consequences from the mere presence of China in Southeast Asia by the variety of actors I mentioned earlier. So now I'm going to give you two empirical cases. One is one that will follow very closely with the narrow definitions of state intention and influence operation, try to achieve a particular outcome in a targeted country, right? So which means it's an influence operation. And then the other one I'll engage with is basically some random effects, ripple effects coming out from just by random, in a way that somehow things happen in Southeast Asia due to China's actions. So the first one is about the promotion of Chinese language and culture in Thailand. Now, you might be very familiar with the Confucius Institutes, right? And so that in Thailand, there are like, so for example, 16 Confucius Institutes, and it's the largest number in Southeast Asia. It's also globally by per capita, this is also the country that has the most number of Confucius Institutes located in Thailand. And every year there are more than 10,000 volunteer teachers from China who go to Thailand, and then there's there are also many teachers training and certification programs that engaged between the two countries. Now, Thailand also have a quite robust demand in learning Mandarin, right? So according to this YouGov poll, and that was done in 2019, Thailand, has more people in Thailand, for example, than any other countries they surveyed, think that it's useful, important to learn Mandarin. Now, it's useful to learn Mandarin in Thailand because this is an easy entry point for market actors who are engaged in the tourism sector, for example, right? I mean, given at that time you have 10 million tourists every year visiting Thailand, then learning some Mandarin will be useful for your profession, right? So that is definitely, supply demand is there. And obviously, from the Chinese state point of view, the Confucius Institute would basically use this Chinese language teaching as a medium of enhancing effective communication and understanding of China's policy and strategy. So this probably fits more clearly a very conventional wisdoms of soft power, in the sense that that is basically what countries do, right? Try to promote its image abroad. But the promotion of teaching of Chinese in Thailand has an additional, very clear political agenda. Now, this is very specific to Thailand, not necessarily to other places, but it is partly to do with legacy of the Cold War and the Chinese Civil War. That is basically as a result of the end of Civil War in China, there is sectors of the KMT refugees who scattered in northern part of Thailand. And then, so these basically are so-called Yunnanese. They originally from Yunnan. They were the soldiers, and then their families from Yunnan province, and they settled in northern Thailand, right? So these communities, particularly in provinces of Chiang Mai, etc., there are quite a lot of those sort of Chinese villages, but they essentially have affiliations and loyalties, and are very deeply tied with the Republic of China in Taiwan, right? And so because of that, existence was directly attributed to the Cold War, and that's why this is the most loyal community towards the ROC government among overseas Chinese communities in Thailand, right? So if we think about lower part of Thailand, most of overseas Chinese communities can be Daejio, can be Hokkien, and those ones has already basically claimed the motherland as the mainland. But this community, Yunnanese, continue to have very close tie with the ROC government in Taiwan. So it is here the competition for education provision has been going on between the PRC government and ROC government for decades. In 2006, there was the first consular outreach from the Chinese consulate in Chiang Mai, basically to offer textbook and curriculum for the Chinese school system that has been in place, and actually was in fact set up by the Taiwanese government since 1980s. So what the PRC government has done is they established their own school, own Chinese language school system in northern Thailand. They provided curriculum and textbooks. They are in line with mainland education, and also offer scholarships for students to study in mainland China. But then clearly the purpose is that they want students to support the peaceful unification of the homeland, right? So that is very clear. The political agenda is to win over the mind and hearts of those Cold War warriors to support the mainland China instead of the Taiwanese government, right? So the implications of this case essentially is that there is tremendous amount of capital being invested into this provisions of language and education in northern Thailand to essentially change what the local Chinese community understand the meaning of being Chinese. So this, from my point of view, is a very clear operation, influence operation that has a very, very clear targeted goal to change the behavior of this community in northern Thailand. Right. So this is the inference. Now, I'm going to talk about unintended consequences of China's presence in a neighboring country of Myanmar, in northern Myanmar. So if you travel to northern Myanmar, and that's where my fieldwork, I did my fieldwork in area around La Chaux in 2019. So you'll notice that basically the hills, in much of the hills in northern Chiang state, they are in fact quite tremendous amount of, how should I say, deforestation. You see rows and rows of maize has been planted in the region for the past decades, right? So basically the foothills of those rolling mountains in northern Chiang state has been pretty much covered by maize, right? So there's empirically, if you look at the data sets from the global forest change data set, there's accelerated pace of deforestation in northern Myanmar. Between 2019, there's average annual rate of 0.5 forest loss in the area. Now, previously, much of this deforestation were attributed to timber trade, but then again, as a result of the banning of timber trade, and that number has significantly reduced. So instead, what happened was an agricultural transformation that has been going on in northern Myanmar that has led to this deforestation rate. Now, what was the reason for this agricultural transformation? So part of the cause was global, right? There is a global commodity price shock around 2010, right? At the time, the price for maize shot up significantly, right? So basically, and as a result, Myanmar's maize production also gone up, basically in line with the global price change, right? Basically, when the price of maize going up, people are going to plant more maize because it's more expensive, more profitable, right? And then coinciding with that was that the rising domestic Chinese demand for animal feed for domestic consumptions of meat as a result of the rising income and the people's dietary change. However, due to Chinese state corn subsidies policies, domestically, domestic corn in China are often more expensive than international corn. So that means that it's cheaper to import than buying domestically, right? So that's basically the situation particularly since 2010-11 onwards. So as a result of the price differences, that is dramatic increase of Chinese import of corn since 2010 and 11. You can see that the number shot up significantly after 2010. Now, so obviously most of these corns are probably being satisfied by imports from the US, from Brazil, and etc. But in terms of Myanmar's case, particularly for northern Myanmar, right, it is a very natural outlet for Myanmar's maize because it was geographically much closer to the Chinese border, and also the border was porous. So the expansion of maize cultivation in northern Chiang state is directly related with this supply demand from the neighboring Chinese market, right? So that leads to an accelerated rate of deforestation, particularly in northern Chiang state, which is the region that directly borders China. So that it is a region that suffers the most amount of deforestation. And also, if you look at the timing of this deforestation, that goes very closely with the maize plantation, the corn market price fluctuation that is driven by the Chinese market. However, there is a twist in the story in the sense that the Chinese state continued to ban maize import from Myanmar. So on the one hand, there is national import quota for corn is only 7.2 million tons, which mostly are earmarked for state-owned enterprises, not for petty businessmen on the border, right? At the same time, Myanmar corn was considered as disease. Anyway, there's no sort of agreement between the two countries in terms of disease inspection and quarantine mechanism. So technically, Myanmar corn is not legally permissible to be imported into China. So what that means is that it led to a rampant smuggling of corn across the national borders. There is an irregular enforcement. The border is too long, right? We're talking about 2,000 kilometers of border. So that means that the much of those corns in northern Myanmar were most of them were basically smuggled into Chinese market. But then again, depending on the how the Chinese border inspection customs enforce its inspection mechanisms, sometimes that leads to, for example, the border more tightly controlled, then sometimes it's more loosely enforced. And then that creates schisms between commodity production cycle and as well as financing for local farmers. So sometimes people anticipate the ability to sell their corn in this year, but somehow because the border has been relatively closely monitored, then they couldn't really sell easily, and then often leads to some kind of financial losses for local farmers, etc. So which you can argue that leads to tremendous amount of financial precarity for local communities in the region. Right. So this is a case, and people can, if you want to draw a correlation, then yes, because of rising demand of meat consumption in China, there is a ripple effect in Myanmar that leads to the expansion of maize plantation that led to deforestation, as well as lead to economic precarity, particularly on parts of the poor farmers in the region. But then again, is it really Chinese influence? Try to deliberately sabotage the Myanmar agricultural production cycles and try to to put those the poor farmers into poverty? Probably not, right? So that is we cannot really improve, for example, the intention by the state, whether this is a deliberate act of influence in a neighboring country, even though the result is very clearly related with what's happening in China. Okay, so by this, what I mean is that when we talk about China's influence or its presence in Southeast Asia, what it means for the region, we have to be careful in terms of, first of all, a variety of actors who come out from China. We're talking about 1.4 billion people, right? Certainly some people are affiliated with the state, but many are not. And then somehow everything is lumped together as China, right? So we need to differentiate what are these actors, and that is the first element. The second point I want to emphasize throughout the talk is that many of those things that does have implications on the ground, they by no means are related with a particular intention by either the Chinese state or the variety of actors people we're talking about, right? So we have to be careful in terms of many things that do occur, but then we need to differentiate versus those very clearly intended influence operations versus the ones that are not. This is particularly the case and more prominent for Southeast Asia because of the complicated history the region has, and also the geographical proximity the region has with China. Particularly on a historical point, and one element I want to emphasize is the element of the diaspora communities, and then the variety of associations that have this, let's say, historical relations with either with Chinese mainland or with Taiwan. Right? So this is an element of history we need to be careful. And the other one is about geography. This is a region that is most accessible from China. This is also a region that received the most amount of tourists from China before the COVID pandemic. So I don't know what will happen given the current COVID situations in the lockdowns in China. But then again, you know, if we assume that is only temporary, but then that means this kind of pattern that I talked about now will probably repeat in the future. So so that's why what we need to be careful and also be concerned is that if that is the case, where this is the region that is most going to be most intensively engaged with China, with increasing, let's say, you know, free movement of goods and people, etc., then we have to look at those wide-ranging implications on the ground. But then again, they are not necessarily related with the Chinese state intention to influence those countries. So we have to be careful to differentiate them from each other. I will stop here, and I'm happy to engage with conversation with Professor Emerson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very specific and focused and clear. We have one case where China's, I mean, I hesitate even to use, you know, the singular noun China, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's awkward here because we're trying to disaggregate China. So, but the case of the Confucius Institutes, you feel is a pretty clear indication that there is intention to influence. We didn't get into the results of that effort, the extent to which it has succeeded or failed, particularly with regard to the case that you mentioned vis-a-vis Taiwan. And then the second illustration of unintended consequences regarding the relationship of meat and maize and so forth, deforestation. Well, first of all, in the conversation that we had before we began, you did briefly mention that there was perhaps some material that you might not have time to deal with. And so insofar as it casts light on your argument, you know, we do have time for you to add any empirical material that you feel is necessary. But I guess my response is, to begin with, the following. You know, ideally, if we had time and scope, which we lack, because the focus here is of course on China and Southeast Asia, not China in other parts of the world. But how then can we generalize? How then can we say that China's influence with regard to a particular issue, whether it be ideological or you know, the import of certain commodities, whether it be economic, political, cultural, and so forth, how can we distinguish intended influence from unintended consequences, events, and I suppose you might even say unintended influence? And here, you'll forgive this comment, Enze, but I do want to have an exchange. This will be taken, I think, as a very, very American comment, for which I apologize. Having said that, the word that is missing from your presentation is democracy. Now, I don't want to delve into the complexities of that term, but wouldn't you say that, other things being equal, a country that does not practice democracy, insofar as democracy implies a diversity, take, for example, the notion of the non-governmental organization. We know that PRC, Chinese security laws, more or less restrain, some would argue virtually eliminate, civil society. Non-governmental organizations are operating under the shadow of the Chinese state. Some are operating as agents of the Chinese state. And so in your admirable effort, which I support, to disaggregate China, don't you think that this is made particularly difficult under the regime of Xi Jinping? You know, if in fact economic reform, there was great hope, of course, back in the day, that economic reform would take advantage of a diversified economy and so forth and so on. And some people even thought that it might lead to democracy. But instead, what has happened is that Xi Jinping has moved in the opposite direction. So to what extent does this set of variables affect your research, and what I take to be your argument that we should treat China as less of a unitary actor, whereas maybe the facts of the matter point in the opposite direction?
So I'll engage with the last point in terms of the democracy variable, right? When you look at Southeast Asia, the countries that can call itself democracy probably is only Indonesia and the Philippines, and by a stretch, Malaysia, right? Not necessarily the other countries that we're engaging with, right? There is not necessarily any clear sort of difference in terms of how much state-society relations there are, quite different from the Chinese version. Right? I mean, if you think about, you know, the military government now in Myanmar is even worse, right? Vietnam is basically a mini China in terms of many ways that state engages with society, right? So I don't really think when now we're engaging, I'm trying to talk from the perspective from the region. Many times democracy is not really a variable that people are concerned with on the ground. Some countries probably they are, some countries probably don't consider that is that important. For many ordinary people, what often China means is economic opportunity, whether people can make money out of that. So that's why I think you know, from the U.S. point of view, and also, you know, there are many people who are concerned about, let's say, the you know, the growing you know, the authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, and then people, I mean, that is also actually another sort of chapter I'm working on. So you can certainly argue that in certain cases that the Chinese government did offer support for particular governments in the region to offer legitimacy during time of a crisis, right? So I'm thinking of the Thai government of Bayut Janwocha since 2014 coup. I'm talking about Aung San Suu Kyi's government during the time when she was under pressure for the Rohingya crisis. Right? At the time, basically, China does offer support for these governments when they were under pressure domestically. But then again, it's on the other hand, but then again, you cannot. But then on the other hand, you cannot really prove the point that the reason these countries become authoritarian is because of China. I think that argument is much more difficult to prove empirically, right? So if you look at the Thai case, then it's authoritarianism is very much domestically engendered due to a long history of military involvement in politics. So that's my first response to your question about the democracy variable. Now, and you mentioned about the economic component, and then for me, right, the current COVID and then the closeness, the increasing closeness of the Chinese border and the Chinese economy, I think that is going to have much more sort of strong implications in Southeast Asia than authoritarianism in Beijing. So before COVID, for example, right, the regime is one dimension, the authoritarian, whatever, I mean, Xi Jinping in power or whatever. But what on the ground is that when you still have active movement of people and goods, those things haven't really changed, But since then, those things have changed, right? So we can think about the borders are closed, right? Now the Myanmar-China border are tightly shut, right? There's border fences basically set up to prevent people from Myanmar to come into China, right? So all those, so let's say agricultural development that is going on in northern Myanmar, we're talking about fruits, talk about, all like rubber, all kinds of things. They cannot really even easily enter China market anymore. Now, for me, the closeness of, if that is the trend that China is going, then that increasing in closeness of China will have much more implications for Southeast Asia than Xi Jinping's authoritarianism itself. So that's my response to a question about that.
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot that you've said, and let me begin. I don't want to change the subject, and so perhaps I should not have used the word democracy, because then that got you thinking about Southeast Asia. Actually, it's not true to sort of say that Southeast Asia is just a whole bunch of authoritarian regimes. That's a wild exaggeration. Most of the measures of degrees of democracy in Southeast Asia indicate that there are no full liberal democracies, with the possible exception of Timor-Leste, which is not even a member of ASEAN, and that of the 10 countries, roughly half are partly democratic, which is another way of saying that, they don't have zero democracy. They're not totally authoritarian, right? But the other half, indeed, are very much authoritarian. And I'm not talking about the description of Southeast Asia. What I'm interested in is whether your argument stands effectively given the concentration of power in China. Well, let's not use the term democracy at all. Forget democracy, right? We simply know that, especially under Xi Jinping, and the instance that you mentioned of borders because of the pandemic is, of course, a good illustration of how top-down, how extraordinarily top-down that policy is. But that's not an exception in China. There are all kinds of top-down policies. Digital authoritarianism is alive and well and living in China, and you have to be careful what you put on WeChat or what it is. I mean, censorship, for example, right? And the more we learn about China's relationship with civil society, the clearer it is that the Communist Party is not interested in civil society. They're not interested in diversity. Otherwise, there would have been economic reform, as one thought might happen, right? Years ago, when I think a lot of Westerners were optimistic that China would, in fact, engage in a more market-based kind of economy.
Actually, I would consider the argument to be opposite. I think what China has done is, in fact, proved to Southeast Asian government that you can achieve economic miracle without being democracy.
Well, I didn't say you can't achieve economic growth. No. Of course you can. An authoritarian regime can grow. That's exactly what China has shown. But you're changing the subject. Forgive me, Enze, you're changing the subject. The subject is whether we should decentralize our understanding of China. That's the issue, right? Because until we do that, we can't accurately measure, as you have nicely done in these two contrasting cases, the influence that China exerts in Southeast Asia, right? So that's the argument. Now, to the extent that you're wrong, that in fact you're underestimating the concentration of power through the Chinese Communist Party, then other things being equal, one would have to say that the behavior of China is less easily taken apart and say, well, this is just a couple of people, who are highly ranked in some part of the bureaucracy. They're going off on their own. No, I mean, if they tried to go off on their own, they would be called short, right? That would not be allowed to happen, right? And so, I'm not disagreeing with you that we need to pay attention to the diversity, but take, for example, take the argument that the view from Xinjiang towards Southeast Asia, you never mind the issue of the people there, is different from the view of Beijing. And I agree completely. If you're in Beijing and you look at Southeast Asia, your perspective is very different than if you're in one of the provinces near the border with Southeast Asia. And frankly, if we take a look, for example, at the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's fair to say that, the enthusiasm for the Belt and Road Initiative on the border provinces of China is even greater in some ways than it is in Beijing, because they're right there and they want the economic growth that can flow from that. So that's, I think, a persuasive argument of the kind that you're making. But what I have trouble here is, you know, how much you want us to chase that particular view of this highly decentralized China, which in some respects just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so for me, is my target straw man, perhaps, if you want to say, is those media reports basically lump together everything as China, which I don't think that's the case, right? So for example, as the first case I talked about, the Chicago case, right? I mean, that businessman is a fugitive, and he was not even from China, right? I mean, basically said he holds like and some kind of like Bermuda or whatever passports, right? I mean, so why would media continue to emphasize that the China project? I don't get it, right? Yeah. So that's the point.
Should we not use the word China at all? Now, really, this is a serious question.
No, so what I'm saying is basically,
if we didn't use the word China,
in terms of what language you use, right? Is it really a China-backed project? It's not. It's basically by an individual person, business person, who did this project, but somehow media accused that as being China. So I'm just engaging with that kind of argument that what do we mean by China, essentially, right? I mean, there is a tendency, for example, as you probably consider that as a natural thing, because there is not much decentralization, that it's by all means, it's the right thing, just to lump everything together as China, right? Some people think that is the easiest way to do. But empirically, if you look into detail into what exactly is Chinese presence in those countries, they're not.
Empirically, you have just done for some Southeast Asian countries what you recommend not doing for China. Namely, you dismiss them saying, well, you know, they're not democratic. You know, Indonesia is not democratic. Well, I beg to differ. Indonesia.
I did not say that. I said Indonesia is the most democratic country in Southeast Asia.
Right. Okay. But the implication was that very few countries in Southeast Asia are democratic. You use words like Philippines, words like Thailand, words like Singapore. No problem. Then why can't we also use the word China with your qualifications to be careful not to essentialize?
So that's why I can say that. You can say that an individual Chinese businessman, that's okay. But if you say China-backed,
all right, take the individual Chinese business. You say that this individual Chinese business is part of the private sector. It's a non-governmental organization. It has nothing to do with the government. It's separate from the government. How realistic is that in terms of major businesses, including the businesses who's had their tycoons' heads cut off, in effect, by Xi Jinping? The control exercised by the Communist Party does not stop outside the office of a business in China, especially if it's a big business with influence.
That's why that person was a fugitive, right?
So in other words,
I want to talk about this one specifically on this point. So in 2008, there's basically a campaign domestically for what is called anti-gangsters, anti-hooligans, and basically people consider it as a purge, right? So as a result, many fugitives went abroad, right? Went hiding. Those fugitives, they went to Southeast Asia, right? I mean, you can draw a direct link between the blossoming of a casino economy in Cambodia as well as into Myanmar. So, they are fugitives, right? They were persecuted by the Chinese state. They went abroad. So how would that basically considered as basically continue to be monitored and controlled by Beijing? I don't get it.
No, of course not. You're changing the topic yet again.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying basically like many of the things we talk about is not empirically the case.
Enze, listen to me. If the fugitives go to Canada or they go to, I don't know, Argentina, right. Of course, it's harder for China to track them, right?
Right.
Yeah, of course it is, right? And maybe China won't bother. I'm not saying that China.
No, what I'm saying is that people continue to call them as China, even though they are fugitives from China, right? So why would you do that?
So what would you say? They are fugitives from what? You can't use the word China. So what would you say? They're fugitives from a bad time
in a private businessman, right? It's a fugitive from China, but it's not a project backed by China. That is a very clear distinction.
Well, Well, look, if they're fugitives, I don't understand. What project are you talking about?
No, for example, this casino project along the Myanmar border, right? This person is a fugitive from China, right? So why would media continue to call it a China-backed project?
That's very constructive. That's very constructive. We are in total agreement. If there are casinos, and there are, as you know, in Laos on the Chinese border, right? And there are Chinese gamblers who come and use the casinos and so forth. Does this mean those casinos represent China in the sense of track one China, government of China, official China? The answer has to be no. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But at what point do you acknowledge that there might be some utility in using the word China and doing so without violating reality? Are there some instances that come to mind, or maybe not, maybe none?
No, I think there are quite a lot of them, particularly lots of private businesses. We're talking about private business in that we're not talking about, for example, like,
is there
stock market listed enterprises. We're talking about lots of petty businessmen, right? People going abroad, for example, open up a banana plantation in Laos. They are by no means connected to Beijing. Okay, people who are going to open a restaurant in Thailand, people going to open a few, hotels, for example, right? These are business people who are opening by themselves. We're talking about agency, right?
Do you also agree, however, that there are businesses in China or outside of China, based in China? Are there businesses that ostensibly are private, but are strictly under certain rules laid down by the party? That they have, for example, party representatives inside their offices, right? To observe what's going on. And if the party comes and knocks on the door of this private business and says, we would like to look at your books, the private business is going to have trouble resisting. They're going to have to say, hey, yes, okay, because you represent the party, here are our books. In those instances, is it fair to use the word private, that these are private companies? Because in the United States, that would not be the case. If the person knocks on the door, the private company says, hey, get out of here. I'm not going to share you unless you have a warrant, right? Which means a whole legal process. That's not the case in China. I'm not trying to criticize China. I'm trying to be realistic about the limits of your argument. Basically, I agree with the heart of your argument, but I'm afraid I don't want to take it so far that China no longer exists.
I'm not saying China no longer exists. What I'm saying is that when people talk about China, particularly empirically in Southeast Asia, there are a tremendous amount of actors that are not associated with the state.
Okay.
They're actively making an impact, and that's the one I'm engaging with.
Yeah, well, there I agree. We're in agreement there. So I think it's time to open it up for some questions. Well, actually, before that, you mentioned COVID. And I think in your argument, you were treating COVID and the shutting down of China that we've seen because of COVID as a bit of an exception to the thrust of your argument, which is that we read too much into the term China, and we have to recognize that there are a lot of actors. It's very, very diverse. Now, what is the argument there in terms of China's policy? Because this is an act by the state, quarantine, strict quarantine, and so forth, what are the implications of that for China's influence abroad? Does it have an implication? And what is it?
I think the tight border control is going to reduce China's presence in Southeast Asia. So I think if China increasingly turns insular, then its presence in Southeast Asia will be dramatically reduced.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, let me get into the Q&A and see if we have some questions here. Okay. Let's see. Well, here's a historical question. Can we consider recent Chinese assertiveness, inroads, influence similar to what the previous colonial powers exerted? presumably, the French, the English, the Americans, or imposed their values, interests, beliefs, behaviors, and ways of living over the past centuries in Southeast Asia. So basically, the question is China doing what the colonial powers did before in Southeast Asia?
I think, well, from your name, it looks like you're a Thai person. I think there are tremendous amount of differences in terms of what China's presence in Southeast Asia mean versus, let's say, colonial governments have done in Southeast Asia, right? Different colonial governments are quite different in their way of managing colonial society. But when we think about, colonial relations, then obviously that is, the first point would be a political one, right? In a way that you have appointees coming from London, from Paris, that would act as magistrates in different parts of Southeast Asia, right? That's definitely not the case in China, right? So there is no direct political overlordship in that sense, right? If you use the word. Now, in terms of this cultural, economic influence, and I think yes, in terms of the now, I do think in this aspect, China and Japan are similar in a way that the purpose was to put Southeast Asia within the same supply chains that centered on China itself, right? So this is, if you use that as sort of, I don't know, probably some Marx terminology as center periphery, probably that makes sense in a way that sort of like, it follows the same direction of capitalism centered in one place and the Chinese capital going abroad to expand, right? Now, in terms of cultural influences in Southeast Asia, I don't think Chinese language cultural influence in no way comparable to the legacies of particularly English in the region, right? The only exceptions, only attractiveness of Chinese-ness is with very small sectors of the overseas Chinese communities in Southeast Asia. Even that varies across different countries. So I think that there is tremendous amount of limit in terms of, like you mentioned, like Chinese assertiveness, right? Assertiveness mostly probably in some of the diplomatic engagement, not necessarily towards Southeast Asia particularly, but mostly toward the West. That's often considered as assertive, right? It is basically retaliatory in many of its behaviors. But in terms of its growing presence and influence in Southeast Asia, I think that is the differences between, let's say, contemporary China versus colonial governments, and I think that it's not really a good comparison. Right? I mean, we're talking about colonial time, basically, the Singapore revenues go to London. I mean, that's not the case here. Right? I mean, we don't have any comparable such political arrangement.
There is a question about the diaspora, which let me just take the topic. The question is a little bit unclear to me. So in a way, this relates back to the argument we were having about the extent to which China is a unitary actor. And it has been said that, and there is evidence in statements coming from, let's use the word Chinese officials. Let's not use the word China, just use the word Chinese officials. That the diaspora, the ethnic Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, well, I mean, it's not that the statements coming out of Beijing are to kind of, nationalize it in some sense, which obviously would infuriate a number of the Southeast Asian governments, but rather to possibly instrumentalize the diaspora. There's that famous case in Malaysia where the Chinese ambassador made some remarks that at least were taken by the Malaysians to mean that China had a kind of proprietary right to protect the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia. And of course, we have to admit that there is tremendous discrimination against the Chinese and has been historically in Malaysia. So I certainly don't want to deny that at all. But to what extent do you think it is fair to argue that, again, let's just use a term like the leadership of the party. I'm tempted to say Xi Jinping, but who knows what's in the mind of Xi Jinping? I'm trying to avoid the word China. That there are high-ranking individuals, let's say, in China, who are indeed interested in influencing Southeast Asians through the diaspora, in instrumentalizing the diaspora to, for example, encourage local governments to support Chinese foreign policy, the BRI, and so forth. What do you think of that argument?
I think the argument makes sense. So now, in this case, obviously, the China's relation with its diaspora, right, should not be considered as unique phenomenon, right? So I want to put it into comparative perspective. So you can think about Israel with its diaspora abroad, and also we can have more assertive cases of connections with diaspora, for example, like Turkey. Right. So now let's look at Turkey as a case of how Turkish government manages its diaspora in Europe. Turkish government, for example, allows political parties to campaign in cities in Europe on behalf of national elections in Turkey. Right. So that means that it's tremendous amount of political influence of its diaspora, direct engagement of diaspora for what's happening at home. Now, you mentioned the Malaysian case, right, in a way that previously, let's say talk about before 60s, 50s, and then that was the time basically Beijing was directly sort of engaging with the diaspora and really consider themselves as part of its own. Now that mentality is I think is still partly there and probably will become more prominent in the future, right? Now the reason I say this is because recent years, domestically, there are policy debates, for example, to offer an overseas Chinese card for immigration. Okay, so this is going to be something similar to what India has done, for example, or what South Korea has done for its overseas diasporas to give them an access, to work and then whatever, live in India or in South Korea. So many people consider that as if people consider China as the homeland state, and then it is sort of it's a natural obligation, for example, to what it consider as its overseas diaspora. Now, whether people in those countries are going to take up the initiative, that's the other question. Right, and not necessarily everybody in Malaysia is interested, for example, going to living in China. But if you're talking about an overseas Chinese probably in Myanmar, then probably, right? I mean, in some ways, it's all relative to what the local conditions in those countries, right? So there is trends and variations in Southeast Asia on that. Now, previously, now, so the question I saw by Gilbert Wang talk about ROC. So ROC previously have played a much prominent role in engaging with overseas Chinese community in Southeast Asia, but that engagement has reduced or dwindled, partly because of the Taiwanese identity change, right? So if you no longer call yourself as Republic of China, then those overseas Chinese communities are not necessarily your diaspora anymore. So in the case I mentioned earlier, so in the northern Thailand, the Vietnamese community in northern Thailand, that community, because it's so politically related with KMT, right? This is also a community very strongly against Taiwanese independence. So because of that twist, as a result of domestic political change going on in Taiwan, that in some ways pushed this community to be closer to the mainland rather than Taiwan itself. Okay, so that's in some ways that because the ROC has changed, and nowadays it's the PRC who's the sole China who's claiming diaspora than before. Previously, at least there are two Chinas claiming that there's diasporas, but these days only one. Well, mostly it's only one. So how the overseas Chinese community in Southeast Asia can leverage to their advantage. So I think in Thailand's case, the Thai in Thailand, so if you compare Thailand with Malaysia, and you mentioned, right, Malaysian government was very, very angry about the statement made by the Chinese ambassador. But you would notice that when Chinese embassy people talk about the Chinese people in Thailand, or Thai people and Chinese people are brothers, people don't take a problem. You know, Thai people don't really think it's a problem, right? And domestically, for example, politicians can openly claim their Chinese heritage without being politically punished, right? I mean, that's a problem in Indonesia, right? It's not a problem in Thailand. So in Thai case, the reconnection with China, we can talk. People talk about that kind of a reawakening, you know, of that Chineseness, whatever. It's very much on the cultural dimension. There is definitely a trend of re-ethnicization in Thailand, right? But then again, there's much of that is also tied to the economic interest going on by rebuilding that ties, right? So if you look at Thai music, Thai TV, Thai movies, it's very common to find a Chinese component in it. You know, many Thai pop singers, for example, when they release album, they will increase they will include like 1 or 2 Chinese songs, for example, right? Just for the market. So there is, for me, it's much more a very organic kind of engagement, cultural engagement with its homeland. Well, if you use that word loosely, you know, and some probably that grandparents came from southern China. But in Malaysia, Malaysia's ethnic sort of categorization is much more strict, right? And then on the other hand, Malaysia also has very long existing Chinese education system, which is quite different from all the other ones, right? Thailand doesn't have any, right? So that's why those people who don't speak word of Chinese at all, but Malaysia does, right? So how the Malaysian ones can leverage it, I think oftentimes it's much more complicated because of domestic political story within the country, and that's why politicians have to be very careful into what they say, right? They have to be very careful into what they refer to China as what, and then they'll at least, you know, withdraw, like, you know, ayah from the domestic, you know, the Bumi Putra, etc. Yeah. So how that leverage to that advantage, I'm not sure. I think for me, it's much more. Oftentimes, this kind of a cultural reconnection. Much of it, I mean, you know, obviously probably is symbolic, but then there's also quite a lot of them are economical.
If we talk about, I guess, is it okay to use the word, I don't know, is it okay to refer to China's influence, or should we say Chinese influence, or should we say?
Sure. I mean, for me, it's not necessarily. I'm not denying, for example, you're saying that, you know, there are basically state and its presence. What I'm saying is that empirically, when we look into detailed many cases, that oftentimes those traces are not necessarily there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let me use the word China's, or the phrase China's influence, with a footnote. And the footnote says, don't take the unitary position of China too seriously because China is internally diverse, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, your argument would be attached, but I could still use the phrase China's influence. Sure. Now, if I can use the phrase China's influence in Southeast Asia, then here's a question. To what extent do you think the explanation for the degrees of influence, the intensity, the success of influence by China in Southeast Asia, that those comparisons have a lot to do with proximity to China? Now, this is the simplest sort of geographic argument. You know, one shouldn't take it too seriously because, after all, Vietnam is China's direct neighbor. And, you know, anybody who's been to Hanoi and gone to the, you know, museum notices the, you know, the commemoration of Chinese attacks for centuries, right? I mean, so that no love is lost between Hanoi and Beijing, at least in historical terms. But having said that, that's obviously a great exception. But with that exception, would you argue that the maritime countries of Southeast Asia have been less influenced by China than the mainland countries of Southeast Asia? And if so, why? Is it just distance or not? What is it?
I think, okay, so overall, I think when we talk about, let's say, first element about like why in some countries China has more influence than others, right? So we're talking about Chinese state influence than others. Now, if you look at like previous work about Evelyn Goh, for example, she talked about, you know, in cases where those influences really worked was because the existing common interests between those governments and China to begin with, right? So you don't really see many cases that China managed to change the mind of the target country 180 degrees. That you don't really see easily, right? Most of the time is basically they already see eye to eye on many things and they work together and make it work, right? So that's one element. Now, but then again, if you really want to compare the degree of influence between, let's say, from the mainland to maritime, and I think that your argument makes sense, right? Why that is the case, right? So one is essentially geography, right? It's like for me the factors of Chinese influence in Southeast Asia will probably depend upon the diaspora, right? So that's why I would consider the countries that has the most amount of Chinese influence would be Thailand, or Singapore, that's, and Malaysia, right? I mean, that kind of thing. So the diaspora definitely is a big, you can say the vector of influence historically because of the presence of them. And then there's a few mainland countries that border China, only 3 of them, right? Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. Vietnam, yes, that because of historical, like long history of interactions, but Laos actually very little. I mean, if you want to trace any cultural influence of China in Laos, very little, very recent at least, right? Same with Myanmar, right? I mean, it's a very limited amount of Chinese sort of like cultural influence there. So I think it really depends, right? I mean, part of it is geography, but geography, if you look at geography of mainland Southeast Asia, only Vietnam is really flat, connected with China. All the other ones are basically like James Scott who basically saying that those like big mountains or river valleys are difficult to pass. That's why there's not much Chinese sort of presence in Myanmar or in Laos for a long time. Not for a long period of time. So much of those influence came from maritime, right? It's by migration. People get on a boat and they went down to they sailed from Hong Kong to Bangkok and then to Singapore. And that was more of a, let's say, historical, means of influence. Yeah.
If I could, and I mentioned this before we began the session, so I hope this is not a surprise. A few days ago, an organization in Taiwan with the name Doublethink Laboratory.
Okay.
I'm not sure that's the best choice of a name because double talk is negative. I guess doublethink, I don't know. Anyway, that's I won't make a judgment there. So the Doublethink Lab has released a survey, and the survey does try to answer the question that I just posed, and I've been sort of, in a way, posing previously as well. That is to say, to rank order the countries of Southeast Asia by the extent to which they are influenced by China, and obviously China with a footnote. Although in this case, and frankly, I haven't read the full document. I tried to find it online, and I didn't. I ran out of time right before our webinar. So I don't know enough about the methodology to be able to have a strong opinion as to the validity of the findings. But it is interesting that what they did was they not only listed the countries in order of relative Chinese influence, but they also specified the sector, I can use that term, in which the influence was concentrated. The sectors, just so you know, are law enforcement, that is to say, the extent to which China was actually influencing the enforcement of law in, let's say, Brunei, law enforcement, technology, meaning Chinese technology coming in. And here, presumably the state may or may not be involved. It could be a Chinese company, right? A PRC company that's coming in to set up a joint venture or something like that, and with a technological result. The military cooperation. society, which gets at to your non-governmental organizations, getting together. What else? Local politics is another one, as opposed to national politics. Foreign policy, media, and the economy. Okay, so I've gone through that. Now, here are the results. They did this for 36 countries. I'm not quite sure why they picked the 36, but they did. And of those 36 countries, the country that they selected, of all 36, including Kazakhstan, countries all over the world, right? The country they selected as most influenced by, forgive the term, China, Cambodia. And they specified law enforcement, that the implication being China was able to influence the enforcement of domestic law in Cambodia. So that was number one worldwide across all 36 countries, including Africa and Latin America and so forth. The second most influenced country was Singapore. Technology, they emphasized technology. The third, Thailand, they emphasized military. Then we go to Peru, Kyrgyzstan, and then the Philippines, the sixth most, with local politics, which I guess makes a certain sense. I mean, Philippine democracy is very much rooted in local politics. It really began at the local level. But it's interesting that they would list that. Then there's Tajikistan, and then comes Malaysia, the eighth most influenced, and there it's law enforcement. And then the ninth, interestingly enough, is Taiwan, Taiwan itself being influenced by the People's Republic of China. Now, I wonder, would you comment on those findings? Do they make any kind of sense? I mean, Singapore as the second most influenced, I suppose that would argue in favor of the diaspora, because roughly 75%, 3/4 roughly of Singapore are ethnic Chinese. And many of them, of course, some of those, a great many of them actually, their ancestry goes back. They don't speak Mandarin. They don't, maybe not even speak a local dialect anymore. But the diaspora would possibly work in that regard, maybe in the third ranking of Thailand. Cambodia, I suppose, I don't know, proximity. Does that listing make sense, or do you think it's just a waste of?
For me, it makes sense, right? Well, it depends. I mean, so first of all, I haven't seen the document. I don't know what what kind of methodology they use. Right. So I suppose what do they mean by law enforcement? Probably is whether, for example, there's any extradition treaties, or whether they have extradited any people from those places to China before. They use those as evidence to weight the influence. And then you can think about technology. Sure, I mean like 5G, Huawei, whatever. I mean, West countries banned them, but not in Southeast Asia, right? Countries are still engaging with those things. And then military, even though Thailand was, for example, main US, main military ally, but then Thailand do buy some military equipments from China.
Yes.
So I think, I mean, if you give me like a very clear guidelines, so for me, this is a clear case of how should I say, if you say those countries tell me that, oh, these are the ones that China has a lot more influence in Southeast Asia, I think that makes sense. Now, the other question would be that the reason why those countries have those influence is that by choice. Now, by choice is that whether those countries allowed it,
right,
to begin with,
right.
So we just mentioned early on, right? I mean, technology. If you don't want it, you can deny it from entry to your market. So that's the other thing, is that sometimes people, probably local governments, see the value of such a cooperation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that'll be my response to some of those kind of arguments, in the sense that you think about Singapore. I mean, Singapore is very well guarded to its own national interest, right? I mean, let's put it that way, right? It's not just and also the state is very strong to eliminate people who they don't think it's sort of but on the other hand, Singapore is very much welcoming for Chinese investment, right? As I mentioned earlier on, FDI for China, for example, is as much as the US these days to Singapore. Yeah, so that for me is in a way that Singapore government is enabling that because they are making some money or some kind of position from being the bridge between the West and China in some extent. So yeah, I think those kind of the kind of ranking makes sense to me. And so as long as those indexes are clearly defined, what kind of measurement they use, and I think that is good. But ultimately, is that the question I would usually, as I said, like I would have is that what does that mean? Does that mean that those governments are wholly beholden to China, or it's just because there are some what does influence actually mean, right? So it's useful, for example, like you mentioned that Taiwan was ranked like number 9 in terms of how much influence the Chinese state has over Taiwan, right? But then again, well, I mean, there are lots of reasons why that's the case, right? Divided society within Taiwan, that kind of historical relations, baggages of other kind of political parties. So yeah, so it's I think it is kind of ranking makes sense. And also when you told me this how those countries are ranked, I'm not surprised. Yeah.
Well, if I could, this may sound odd after our earlier exchange, but if I could extend your argument to Southeast Asia, in other words, if you're arguing the case for disaggregation, then the same case should be made in Southeast Asia with regard to Southeast Asian countries. And I say countries rather than governments, because governments are only parts of countries. There are societies, there are organizations, and so forth. And again, depending, the key variable is the extent to which there is top-down centralization. Obviously, in a country like Myanmar, Min Aung Hlaing, right, the head of the junta, right, he's not in favor of disagreement from the bottom up. So that's a particular case. But having said that, I'm reminded of the statement that was made by Yang Jiechi in 2010 in Hanoi, which caused such a brouhaha. It's probably a quote that he may regret. I don't know. Maybe not. In which, when the subject of the South China Sea came up, and it turned out that Southeast Asian representatives were very interested in talking about it, and they were concerned about it, and they were concerned about China's claim to the South China Sea. And Yang Jiechi was upset. You could see it. He got red in the face. I wasn't there, but I've read the reports. He actually left the room in order to consult with Beijing, which actually goes back to the notion of the unitary state, because he was, after all, a diplomat. He was the foreign affairs minister of China. And so he was part of the bureaucracy. And he, I guess, got some kind of instructions. He came back into the room. And basically what he said was this. He looked directly at George Yeo, who was at that time the foreign minister of Singapore, and he said, some countries are big countries and some countries are small countries. And that's just a fact. And of course, that statement is constantly reused and reinterpreted and referenced. I mean, essentially, it sounds like Vladimir Putin talking to the Ukrainians. Some countries are big countries. My country is a big country. Your country is, well, actually 44 million people. It's not that small. It's not that big a country, but still. So you see where I'm headed here. Giorgio, as you probably know, is very active economically in China. He has a lot of investments and commitments and so forth. He represents part of the diversity inside Singapore as to what relations between Singapore and China should be. And he's very much pro-Beijing. So is Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore Mahbubani is a cheerleader for China. Now, Bilahari Kosikan, another intellectual, former member of the Singapore government, has very different views of China. And so when we talk about, Singapore being the second most influenced country in all these 36 countries all over the world, we have to remember not to turn Singapore into a unitary object and everybody is, bowing down to China. repeating in a sense the big country, little country position that Kang Chi took in Hanoi. And so it's important, I think, to take your insight, because it is an insight and it's very useful and it's a useful corrective, and apply it not only to China, but to the individual countries of Southeast Asia, and realize that there are differences of opinion in Southeast Asia. And that has to be kept in mind. The last thing I'll say here is that the Pew survey, which you may be familiar with, tends to show, in the case of Singapore, that although the elite is skeptical of China, the ordinary folks at the street level are more supportive. And that would go back to the diaspora argument. If 3/4 of the population, many of them, of course, just regular people on the street, right, doing their own thing, not part of the elite, that they may have ties to China, emotional perhaps, feelings about China that are not shared by the elite, which may be more westernized. I mean, we could debate that. What do you think?
I mean, in terms of Singapore, the difference between the elites and the mass, I don't know. Like for me, I mean, Singapore, I mean, it's certainly there are different diversities, opinions within Singapore, right? But then again, that government has been very effective of closing ranks in terms of what, in the end, they will decide. Right? I mean, they allow certain rooms of debates within itself, but ultimately there is more coherence in Singapore's foreign policy. Right? So that definitely is quite different from other countries in the region. Right? Now, in terms of whether there is any differences between the anglicized elites versus the locals, people on the street who don't, who speak predominantly Mandarin versus or a variety of dialects, that perceptions of China might be different from others. Now, well, I mean, I think which is in some ways, I mean, probably it's a normal thing, right? I mean, if you compare to a Singaporean of Chinese descent versus like say a foreign expat who live in Singapore, certainly the Singapore the ethnic Chinese Singaporean would have a very different view about China versus the Western expats, right? So so this kind of let's say cultural, perhaps historical ties, probably emotional ties, some people probably still continue to have or engage, right? I mean, at least that's just normal. Right? I mean, people in US, for example, many people look at Europe as the ancestral land in the way that look at Europe fondly, because that's where people can originally come from. So why not people from Chinese of direct origin from Southeast Asia can think of the same thing, right? So I think there is nothing really wrong with that.
Yeah. Okay. The last question, we're over time just a little bit. I apologize. Well, no, actually we're not, depending upon my watch may be off by a minute or two. But here's the last question. It comes from Gilbert Wong. And it's an excellent question. We really haven't dealt with it. Why can't China share the South China Sea with Southeast Asian countries?
I think definitely for me, this is kind of question is a domestic question, right? So I personally have the opinion that is basically there's no reason to claim these nine dashed lines to that be so close to the Filipino territory, right? I mean, but then again, the reason why China cannot, let's say, officially concede is a domestic political question. Right. So in a way that perhaps with leadership or within domestic political context, right, make concessions on territories is a no-brainer. And I think in this kind of case, the reason why sometimes you can argue that it's foolhardy that you commit yourself to such a kind of claim, right? And you think it's kind of a ridiculous claim, perhaps. But then again, because they have done it, right? They openly claimed it and committed themselves to the public, and in some ways they are bound by that. So many research have talked about how the Chinese state actually are bound by those kind of public public opinion within domestic context. Right? There are lots of experiment studies have shown that connection. Right. So even though it's a very highly authoritarian state, but people do have very strong opinions on these kind of territory issues. So I think the reason why they cannot necessarily share is because of this kind of domestic legitimacy, nationalism concerns of the Communist Party. Now, in terms of the but then again, there are ways. I think there are probably you can talk about resources are being shared. Perhaps there are cases of where you see the natural resources, etc., being shared between China, Vietnam, etc. But again, in some ways, that's for me, it's mainly a political question. So I don't see I don't understand your second half of the question. It appears of expansionism or something. I mean, for me, the PRC inherited this claim from the ROC government, right? So that's why you mentioned Taiwan there. I mean, Taiwan is even further away from South China Sea, but then somehow they claim the same thing. So that's why I'm saying it's mostly historical. And then when government made a commitment to those claims, then they cannot really easily back down from those things.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you for a very stimulating discourse. Really appreciated. And I take away the moral of the story, I guess, is don't assume that China is a unitary actor. Don't assume that it is equivalent to a single person, that it has, obviously respect the diversity of China, and also the possibility that events are not simply planned, the consequence of a strategy of domination, or expansion, or whatever it might be, but occur for all kinds of other reasons. That is, especially as scholars, it's critical that we understand that and explore that. There's an image in international relations that says countries are like billiard balls on a table, right? And then, the pool player comes along and knocks one ball into another ball. And that metaphor probably has done more damage to clear thinking in international relations studies than any other that I can think of. That is absolutely absurd. No, I'm sorry. Countries are much more interesting. They're much more insubstantial. Their diversity, even drawing the border conveniently on a map, tells us little, as we've been talking, for example, about the diaspora, tells us little about the social breadth and extent, the cultural breadth and extent of a country. Maybe we should be thinking much more in terms of civilizations and so forth. Anyway, very, very interesting and worthwhile ideas. Thank you so very much for your time. And I also want to thank Lisa Lee, who's been very helpful on the technical front. I wish you the best, and I look forward to seeing you on campus.
Yes.
Over the next few months. That'll be
all right. Yes, definitely. Yeah. Dinner. Thank you very much, Don. And it was really, how to say, lively engagement with you. And then, ultimately, I think, I think we had a good conversation. That's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank
you
so much.
All right. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.